Europe is on the brink of all-out war with Russia, and this isn't just speculation, it's a warning from NATO's former top military chief, Admiral Rob Bauer. In early 2024, he gave it 20 years. Now, the timeline has collapsed. Experts say Europe could face a full-scale war within just 3 to 5 years. And the reason? One man, US President Donald Trump. His latest moves sent shockwaves across the continent, shaking NATO to its core and putting Europe on high alert. With every decision, every statement, he's tilting the balance of power toward Russia. And if things continue down this path, Europe may be left with no choice but to fight. So how did we get here? What has Trump done to push Europe toward war? And is there any way to stop the countdown before it hits zero? Let's break it down. For a second, there was a glimmer of hope that he might support Ukraine after all, but now it seems he's gone full pro-Russia. We know this by Trump practically parroting Putin's lines about Ukraine. Former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Richard Shirov has gone as far as to say that Trump is in bed with an indicted war criminal, despite Putin committing the most appalling atrocities in Ukraine. On February 25th, this unnerving alliance was seemingly officially confirmed, with the US joining Russia in voting against a Europe-backed Ukrainian resolution that condemned Moscow's aggression. The US even abstained from voting on its own competing resolution after Europe, led by France, amended it to specifically label Russia as the aggressor. This was a significant blow to the Trump administration at the United Nations, a 193-nation body where resolutions aren't legally binding but serve as a crucial gauge of global opinion. But as of right now, it seems that Trump is only interested in one opinion, Putin's. And believe it or not, he's hearing it straight from the Russian president himself. That's right, on February 12th there was a monumental phone call between Trump and Putin. A full 60 minutes was spent breaking down 3 years of US policy toward Russia. It took 90 minutes, one phone call, for Trump to end the US-led effort to isolate Putin over Ukraine. But what did these two leaders actually discuss? Well, it wasn't just Ukraine, far from it. They covered everything from the Middle East to global energy markets and even artificial intelligence. It seems that Trump got the full geopolitical tour from Putin himself. And this was exactly what Putin had hoped for, a Russia-US dialogue where the world watched from the sidelines. But the worst part, Ukraine was watching from the sidelines too. The country watched as Trump agreed to start peace talks with Russia. In the aftermath, Trump called this conversation lengthy and highly productive, but he didn't mention anything about Russia's invasion. Instead, he focused on shared goals of peace. Putin, as expected, praised Trump even before the call. He echoed Trump's claim that he could have prevented the Ukraine conflict, painting Trump as the ultimate peacekeeper. Putin even endorsed Trump's stance on the 2020 election. The next step? A face-to-face meeting. Sergei Rybakov, Russia's deputy foreign minister, said that preparations were already underway for it. However, he also said this kind of meeting would take intensive prep work, so the exact date remains to be seen. What we do know, however, is that Putin is all in for a Trump meeting. He has gone on and on about rebuilding US-Russia ties and normalizing the relations between the two countries. But where is Ukraine in all of this? Not only has the country and its president been sidelined, but Trump has openly belittled Zelensky, and the Ukrainian president didn't just sit back and stay silent. That's right, while Trump had been cozying up to Putin on one side, he's also been trading barbs with Zelensky on the other. Though the two have been throwing jabs here and there, Trump's February 19th Truth social media post truly crossed a line. In this post, he blasted Zelensky with a series of unfounded claims, so many unfounded claims that we'll need to immediately fact-check each of them. Remember how former President Barack Obama brought his anger translator to the 2015 White House Correspondents' Dinner? Well, this time we're bringing a fact-check correspondent to tackle Trump's claims head-on. Let's break down these statements one by one and see where the facts really stand. Probably the most serious claim Trump made in this post was that Zelensky was a dictator without elections, but the facts don't support this claim. You see, Zelensky was elected to a 5-year term in 2019 with 73% of votes. If you do the maths, you'll know the elections were set for spring 2024. However, due to the ongoing war, these elections were legally suspended. That's because Ukraine's constitution prevents elections under martial law, which was imposed after Russia invaded in February 2022. So suspending the elections isn't some authoritarian move by Zelensky, it's a matter of legal necessity during wartime. Trump also stated that Zelensky talked the United States into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won. But the actual amount of US aid provided to Ukraine since the invasion began is around $183 billion. That's almost half of Trump's claim. It's true that the US has provided extensive support, including military aid, humanitarian relief, and economic recovery assistance. However, Trump's number is grossly inflated. Plus, a significant portion of US aid didn't even go directly to Ukraine. Instead, it boosted the US defense industry by replacing military equipment sent to Ukraine and strengthened NATO's defense posture in Europe. In the post, Trump also took aim at Zelensky's handling of US aid, saying that the Ukrainian president himself admitted that half the money sent was missing. But what does our fact-check correspondent say? Well, this is a reference to comments Zelensky made about the confusion surrounding the $183 billion worth of aid sent to Ukraine. Zelensky said, "I don't know where all the money is," in the context of some funds being misallocated or spent on things that don't directly reach the Ukrainian government or military. However, this statement was quickly distorted by critics and now Trump. Trump also exaggerated the death toll in Ukraine, saying that millions of people have died. The actual number of Ukrainian soldiers killed since February 2022 is estimated at 46,000, in addition to tens of thousands of civilians killed. These numbers in no way come even close to 1 million, let alone millions. He also claimed that Zelensky had done a terrible job managing the war. That's a harsh assessment, especially considering the circumstances. After all, Ukraine has managed to defend itself against Russia's massive military and has even, with substantial US and NATO support, achieved remarkable successes on the battlefield. And it was Zelensky who has led his nation through this unprecedented crisis, rallying his people and the international community. For Trump to call this a terrible job is a stark disregard for the efforts and sacrifices made by the Ukrainian people and their president. But Trump doesn't seem to see it this way. In another instance, he even claimed that it was Zelensky who started the war. Of course, this is a complete misrepresentation of history. It was Russia that invaded Ukraine in 2022 with up to 190,000 soldiers. This happened after months of military buildup on the Ukrainian borders and false justifications about protecting Russian-speaking civilians. Even before that, in 2014, it was Russia that annexed Crimea and started a conflict in Donbass, which was also an unprovoked attack on Ukraine. Trump's claim is not only factually incorrect, but aligns with Russian disinformation that has been debunked by the international community. The comments that Trump is parroting Putin make increasingly more sense, don't they? In another effort to discredit Zelensky, Trump said that the Ukrainian president's approval rating was at rock bottom, down at 4%. This is another inaccurate claim. According to a survey by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, Zelensky retains an approval rating of around 57%, a far cry from the 4% that Trump suggested. Zelensky's popularity has fluctuated due to the war, but his leadership remains strong, particularly in rallying the country and its allies. Zelensky's words directed at Trump, on the other hand, need no fact-check correspondent. All the Ukrainian president said was that Trump lives in this disinformation space, a clear and direct response to Trump's unfounded accusations. Zelensky didn't hesitate to call out the false narratives that Trump was pushing, particularly about Ukraine's role in the war and his leadership. In his own words, Zelensky explained that all of this was coming from Russia. In other words, he made it clear that Trump's rhetoric now mirrors Russian propaganda. There's no need for deep analysis here. Zelensky's message was simple and clear. However, it was this comment that sent Trump on his fiercest tirade against Zelensky. At least that's what some analysts seem to think. Al Jazeera's White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett called Trump notoriously thin-skinned, which could explain his attacks on Zelensky, who he referred to as a modestly successful comedian who was only good at playing former President Joe Biden like a fiddle. These are some pretty harsh words, almost too harsh to be caused by Zelensky's rather tame comments. This makes you wonder whether there's more to this spat than just a disagreement over truth and lies, and there likely is. Some commentators believe that Trump's animosity towards Zelensky goes back to a much older grudge, the 2019 impeachment drama. At the time, Trump pushed Zelensky to investigate his political rival Biden and his son, Hunter Biden, over alleged corruption linked to a Ukrainian company. This pressure, which eventually led to Trump's first impeachment, clearly left a lasting sour note. As Shiref suggests, Trump has a long memory and is vindictive when it comes to perceived slights. From his perspective, Zelensky's refusal to go along with his demands could have sparked a deep resentment, explaining the hostility that plays out now. There's also a more business-oriented reason behind Trump's frustration. Trump had hoped to strike a deal with Zelensky for access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, reportedly worth over $26 trillion, in exchange for US military support. However, Zelensky didn't buy into the deal, rejecting it as being too tilted towards US benefits and lacking sufficient security guarantees for Ukraine. This was a sharp blow to Trump's transactional mindset. It left Trump, who constantly paints himself as the master of the deal, fuming, possibly amplifying his criticism of Zelensky. But why does all of this matter to the rest of Europe? Why does it matter that Trump is buddying up with Putin and undermining Zelensky? It matters because it's making a peace deal that only involves Russia and the US, a terrifying possibility. No Ukraine and no Europe at the table, and such a peace deal can only mean one thing: a Europe versus Russia war in the near future. Let us explain. Trump's approach to ending Russia's war against Ukraine is shaking up international diplomacy, and not in a good way. By pushing for direct talks with Putin, he's actively sidelining Ukraine and Europe entirely. Of course, Zelensky was quick to respond, saying his country won't accept any outcome that comes from negotiations where Ukraine doesn't have a seat. He even went as far as to postpone a crucial trip to Saudi Arabia to show just how serious this issue is. This comes after Russian and US representatives met in Saudi Arabia to discuss a peace deal for Ukraine, again, without Ukraine. The European allies are equally uneasy, with Britain already offering to send troops or even Typhoon fighter jets to support Ukraine's security in the event that this Rush deal goes through. Britain's concern is clear: the country can't afford another Afghanistan situation. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer explained it best: "We cannot have another situation like Afghanistan, where the US negotiated directly with the Taliban and cut out the Afghan government." But that's exactly what Trump's administration seems to be pushing for. With Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz flying out to Saudi Arabia for talks with Russian officials, there's real uncertainty about the role Europe or Ukraine will play. In fact, it's not even clear if Ukrainian officials will be invited to these talks at all. Trump's words have been murky at best, suggesting that Ukraine will be involved, but offering no details on when or how. Zelensky's remarks at the February 2025 Munich Security Conference summed up the situation best. Decades of the old relationship between Europe and America are ending. Although Trump's team argues that Europe is still being consulted in these negotiations, not everyone seems to agree, and this even includes Vice President J.D. Vance. During his visit to Europe, Vance made it clear that the US would lead these negotiations, whether the Europeans liked it or not. So much for European influence, right? It doesn't help that Trump has been openly talking about re-engaging Russia, even suggesting that Russia should be allowed back into the G7 after being expelled following the annexation of Crimea in 2014. For Trump, it's not about liking Russia, it's about putting the great powers back in control and pushing for a new international approach that doesn't necessarily prioritize European interests. Heather Conley, a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, warned that this approach resembles a 19th century-style concert of great powers, where decisions are made between a few influential countries at the expense of everyone else. But here's the issue: this approach is not just outdated, it's naive. The core problem here is simple. Trump's negotiations ignore Russia's deeply rooted, unyielding ambitions. Putin's design for Ukraine isn't a negotiable stance. He wants Ukraine wiped off the map as a sovereign state, and there's no indication that he's willing to compromise on that goal. By entertaining this idea as if it were a bargaining chip, Trump is fundamentally misunderstanding Russia's intentions. This is the kind of naivete that could result in disastrous miscalculations. It could result in Putin getting everything he wanted, and more. Putin wants Ukraine to become a puppet state, effectively reducing it to a client of Russia. This means Russia aims to annex large parts of Eastern Europe and possibly demilitarize the entire country, and Trump's positions have opened the door for those goals. By declaring that Ukraine's NATO membership is impractical and dismissing the idea of returning to the 2014 borders, Trump is signaling to Putin that the US may not oppose these fundamental Russian aims. Even worse, the US is signaling that Ukraine should give up the 20% of its territory that Russia has seized, including Crimea. This will be a massive concession, and it's an outcome that aligns perfectly with Putin's aims. Not only would this strip Ukraine of vital land, but it would also send a clear message that Russia can take territory by force without facing meaningful consequences. Not the best message for the rest of Europe. Even if Ukraine doesn't become a puppet state, it's almost certainly not getting the security guarantees it wants for the future. This brings us back to the issue of NATO. Putin has long viewed NATO's eastward expansion as a direct threat. The possibility of Ukraine joining this alliance was one of his infamous red lines, and now Trump is actively pushing for Ukraine to abandon its NATO aspirations. In other words, he's playing right into Putin's hands. Trump is also aiding Putin's broader geopolitical goals. One of Putin's key ambitions is to decouple Europe from America's security influence. With Trump's actions, threats, and promises, this seems more and more likely. By suggesting that NATO won't defend Ukraine and forcing Europe to handle its own defense, Trump is essentially neutralizing NATO as a counterbalance to Russia's ambitions. Trump's stance even aligns with one of Putin's more historical objectives, a new Yalta Agreement. If you're unfamiliar with it, the Yalta Conference in 1945 divided Europe between the West and the Soviet Union. By rolling back NATO's presence in Eastern Europe, this region becomes a smorgasbord for Putin, and not just this region, the entirety of Europe. After getting everything he wants in Ukraine, Putin surely won't stop there. His ambitions are too far-reaching for this. The next on his radar? Probably the Baltic states. These nations, once part of the Soviet Union and historically considered by Russia as its natural sphere of influence, are now NATO members, which complicates matters. Putin has already set his sights on other regions like Moldova and Georgia, manipulating elections in Romania and testing the waters with smaller incursions. But it's the Baltics that pose the biggest challenge. As NATO allies, they're crucial to Europe's defense structure, and any Russian move against them would almost certainly lead to direct conflict with NATO. This brings the possibility of war much closer, as Europe's collective security will be directly threatened. And remember, NATO will likely have to defend these countries without the US. So to stop Russia and ensure the continent's future security, Europe must take charge and act decisively. For too long, it's relied on the US as the backstop for its defense, but the era of Pax Americana is now over. The responsibility now lies squarely on Europe's shoulders, and the first order of business is realizing that. Europe must recognize that it's standing alone, and it must rise to the occasion with a comprehensive, united defense strategy. But don't be fooled, that strategy still includes Ukraine. Europe's support for Ukraine isn't just a matter of solidarity, but of necessity. Ukraine's battle is Europe's battle. If Russia succeeds in conquering Ukraine, other parts of Europe might follow suit. To prevent this, Europe needs to provide Ukraine with everything it takes to force Russia to reconsider its course of action. Ukraine must give Russia a bloody nose, as Shiref put it. A decisive defeat for Russia in Ukraine is the only thing that will make Moscow think twice about its imperial ambitions. But Europe can't simply offer token gestures of support. It needs to show up with the military muscle to make a real difference. This means committing to significant increases in military aid, improving logistics, providing advanced weapons, and ensuring that Ukraine has the intelligence and surveillance capabilities to counter Russian moves. This is where Europe must take a hard look at its own defensive capabilities. The gap left by the US must be filled by Europe itself. Bruegel, a European think tank, recently quantified what Europe needs to fill these gaps. Some of the items on the list are as follows: a military force equivalent to 300,000 combat-ready US troops, at least 1,400 tanks, 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles and 700 artillery pieces, at least 2,000 long-range loitering munitions per year, 1,150mm shells per 90 days of combat, and a $262 billion increase in European defense budgets annually. To achieve these goals, European defense industries and armies will need a serious overhaul. But above all else, Europe must learn to act as one, just like Russia and the US do. The continent simply can't afford to rely on a patchwork of national efforts that fail to create a cohesive strategy. Now, this doesn't mean Europe needs to reinvent the wheel, it just needs to establish a unified command and work on interconnecting the European forces. Otherwise, Putin will come for everything Europe holds dear, one piece at a time. The good news is that Europe seems ready to overcome all the challenges and stand up to Putin, with or without the US. But now we ask you, will it be successful in this? And will this confrontation even happen, or do you see Trump coming to his senses before it's too late? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.